Hello everyone. Today I'm going to share with you 3 stories that remain unsolved to this day. Of the 3 stories that I'm going to share, one of them is completely a lie, while the other 2 are completely true. At the end of the 3rd story, I will reveal which one was made up and which 2 are based on true stories. I will change the name or shorten the names of the true stories, but I will reveal the full names at the end. If this sounds like something you would like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and hit the like button, and I will know to keep making more. Thank you, and let's begin with story number 1. 2 bodies but no identities. In August of 1976, a truck driver came across something that would be burnt in his memory forever in South Carolina. He came across the bodies of 2 young adults, one male and one female, both on the side of the road in the early morning. The location was far from civilization. He contacted the authorities immediately, and when police arrived, it was quickly determined that both were shot 3 times each. However, no murder weapon or really any other evidence would be found. Numerous reports spread about who these 2 were. Some believe they were siblings, some believe they were European backpackers. They did appear to be wealthy due to having healthy teeth and jewelry on them. But the identities of these 2 deceased individuals would become a mystery. They were referred to as the 2 does. Now, let's change the subject a little bit and tell you about a man named Jack. Jack was born in 1946 in Massachusetts, but the family later moved to Pennsylvania. Jack was an only child, and when he finished in high school, he enlisted in the Army. That's where he became trained as a mechanic. In the early 1970s, Jack got married and had a child, but the marriage would not last, and soon after he filed for divorce. There are reports that he had a second child with a different woman, but that has yet to be confirmed. What is confirmed is that in December of 1975, Jack's family reported to have had contact with Jack, but that was the last day they say they spoke with him. In 1985 and 1988, a request was made to declare Jack officially deceased, as no one had any contact with him over the last 10 plus years. Jack's mother passed away in 2004 and never knew why her son had seemingly disappeared or where he went. Now, let's share the story of a woman named Diane. Born in 1951 in Minnesota, Diane was one of 5 siblings. Throughout high school, she was considered quite popular and belonged to many clubs. However, her main love was music. This led her to touring the West Coast with a 3-group band called Sunlending when she finished high school. She got married in 1972 to an older man who also had a love for music, and they ended up settling down in Colorado. Like Jack, Diane was reported missing by her family in December of 1975. Her and her husband were in the process of filing for divorce. It may come as no surprise that these 2 individuals are the 2 murdered bodies mentioned at the beginning of this story. This discovery wouldn't be found out until 2021, as till then, no one had any idea who they were. However, that is all that is known to this day. If you notice the dates and locations mentioned, it only leads to a lot more questions. Where Jack and Diane were reported missing is nowhere close to each other, and also nowhere close to where their bodies were found. Yet, they went missing in the exact same month. Had they known each other prior? Some believe they had. Others believe they met maybe weeks or even days before their murders. Also, there is an 8-month gap from when the day they were reported missing to when they were murdered. What were they doing in those 8 months? Some believe they were simply living off the grid, escaping the bad marriages and trying to lay low. Whether together or not is unknown. Lastly, and the biggest question of all, is who murdered them and why? To this day, no one has been convicted of their murder. They did have a suspect in the 1970s, but nothing came of it, and he has since passed away. While it is helpful to the families that their identities are now known, nearly 50 years after they disappeared, it still leaves a lot unanswered. Hopefully, in time, we get justice on who shot these 2 young adults and left their bodies on the side of the street. Story number 2. Armored trucks robbed for decades. There are many armored truck companies across the world, with different levels of danger depending on where you live. Personally, I have actually worked for one of these companies for several years, and I know the measures that go into protecting the people and the money inside. However, in 1989, there started a string of robberies that is believed to have been spanned for many years to come. The first robbery happened in Minnesota in 1989, when a guard who was unloading the truck was approached by 3 heavily armed men. He said he immediately went for their weapon, but was quickly subdued. He said the people attacking him seemed swift and collected, and did not seem to be panicked, acting very professional in their moves. Almost simultaneously, a van pulled in front of the armored truck and placed what appeared to be a bomb under the hood, although that was later determined that the bomb was a fake. In less than 1 minute, they had stole what would be close to $1 million in today's money, and then they simply vanished without a trace. All the evidence that they could gather was from the fake bomb. They determined that it was very similar to a device used 3 years prior in a robbery in Maryland, where the robbers made off with almost $600,000. While it was not proved that this was the same gang, it certainly did appear so in both cases. The gang was determined to be very commando-like. Not only that, but they were very, very brilliant in covering up their tracks. So far, the vehicles they used were all stolen, and they were later found abandoned, but wiped clean of all evidence. It would not be long until this gang is believed to have struck again. Not even a year later, they would attempt to rob a Brinks truck in Minnesota, but this one would not go as planned. While one of the drivers remained in the truck, another was guarding the bank. They were approached by what is believed to be the same gang. They ordered the one guard who was outside to the ground, and they pulled a van in front of the armored truck, similar to the robberies that had occurred earlier. When the van pulled in front of the truck, one of the gang members shot 2 rounds, but because it was an armored truck, it did not go through. This was believed to mostly be for intimidation purposes. The driver, regardless, was now fearing for his life and drove off, striking the van in the process. The robbers continued to fire at the vehicle. He did not want to abandon his partner though, and he circled around the parking lot and drove back. Luckily, his partner was still on the ground, but uninjured. The robbers, now believing that they had no way to get into the vehicle, and apparently not wanting to injure the guard that they did have, decided to drive away. However, the armored truck driver was not letting him go that easily. He took the armored truck and rammed their van. Despite this, the robbers were still able to escape, and even though a number of shots were fired, no one was injured. Once again, they found an abandoned vehicle that proved to be stolen, and once again, there was no evidence left inside. The robbers have simply vanished cleanly again. Police put up barricades, but nothing was found. Authorities believe that there are 4 members to this gang, and there are competent sketches of the 3 of them, but the 4th one has yet to be seen. This is not believed to have been their final robbery. In New York, in 1990, the robbers professionally executed another armed robbery that took less than 2 minutes. Investigators do believe that this was the same gang that committed the robberies earlier in Minnesota. Then, 7 years later in 1997, another armored truck heist was committed, back in Minnesota this time with a similar style, but once again, they escaped without a trace. That is believed to be the last time they committed an armored truck heist. To this day, they have never been caught. If still alive, they would be in their 60s or 70s. Many people were fascinated by this case, because the robbers never physically really harmed anyone, despite being given the chance. They simply wanted the money and left. If you have any information on this case, please contact your local authorities. Story number 3, Mountains Mystery. This story starts off with 2 friends, one named Victor, age 30, and Marcus, 37. While both of these friends were quite adventurous, most of their adventures were reserved to the small town they both resided in, which was located in Arizona. They would mostly go on hikes, road trips, canoe rides, never really venturing outside of their own country. Victor himself lived a very simple life. Nothing really too much was known about him prior to this incident you will soon learn about. Most of his friends say that he was a very easygoing, nice, gentle, and loyal friend. Essentially, nothing that would really jump out as anything to be cautionary about. Marcus, the older of the 2 friends, was a little bit different than Victor. He was a full-time paramedic, he was very active on social media, and he seemed to have a lot of friends. A lot more than Victor seemed to have outside of the 2 of them. He had his own house, a fiance, and just in general, seemed to be a very popular person. Despite the fact that these 2 were very different, they did remain very good friends, mostly because of their passion for local adventures. That love for adventure would take them down to the beautiful country of Peru. As neither had really done a lot of traveling, they did decide to make their first trip more of a dramatic one. They were going to hike the Inca Trail. While there are different versions of the Inca Trail hike, this particular one was a 4-day hike through the Andes Mountains, which, on the 4th and final day, they would be waking up extremely early, about 3 or 4 in the morning, and hiking to get to the sun gate just in time as the sun rises, weather permitting, with the hopes of catching Machu Picchu. So, in March of 2015, these 2 flew off to Lima. They spent a couple days there, did some sightseeing, then they flew off to a city called Cusco and spent a few days there, also to get acclimatized to the altitude. And eventually, on day 6 of their trip, they started their hike on the Inca Trail, which is also where they met up with the group they would be hiking with. It had 10 total members. This included Victor and Marcus, and 2 guides, so 6 other hikers were joining them, as well as an equal amount of porters. The Inca Trail can be very challenging. It's very up and down, and you're at a very high altitude, but what most people remember is the beautiful mountain views. Victor and Marcus got to know many members of the group along the way, and most of them described them as very pleasant and very friendly guys. They were also known as the more fit members of the group, and almost because of this, kind of took a bit of a leadership role, although that was more Marcus than Victor. The first 2 nights, everything seemed to go well. They would hike throughout the day, stop for lunch and supper, which was usually be their campsite. Everyone would call it an early night as they knew they had to wake up at 5:30 a.m. the next day, plus were tired from hiking all day. Everyone was in pairs, and the pairs would share a tent. This included Marcus and Victor. On the 3rd night, the night where everyone had to wake up at 3:30 a.m. to get to the Sungate in time, is where everything would change. The porters, the people who are helping the guides perform their usual morning routine, at 3:30 a.m. they would shake the tent and softly call out their names, offering them a cup of tea. This morning, when shaking Victor and Marcus's tent, they received no reply. The porter shook it again, a bit harder, and called out a little bit louder this time, but again, no reply. He called over the guide and the guide opened the tent. The greeting inside is not something he could have possibly imagined. In the tent lay Marcus, lying on his back with his eyes open. They shook his foot, but they quickly realized he was dead. No blood was found. They had believed that he had been strangled at some point in the night. Victor, however, was missing. He was nowhere to be seen. The rest of the group was alerted and immediately they began calling into the pitch black Andes Mountains, but they heard no response. Victor had simply vanished, and to this day has never been found, dead or alive. This incident was not the first fatality on the Inca Trail, but it was the first murder in quite some time. And the hikers and anyone who read this story had multiple theories about what happened. The area that the hike took place is far from civilization, but also not really near any local tribes, at least none that were known. However, some believe that a group of locals broke into the tent, murdered Marcus, and then kidnapped Victor, only to return him to their village to do God knows what. Maybe a sacrifice, maybe a meal, or maybe make him one of their own. This theory is not believed by many, as Victor, who stands 6'3" and weighs just over 200 pounds, he would surely put up a fight and someone would have hurt him in the night. Another theory is that Victor killed Marcus himself, then fled into the Andes Mountains in the middle of the night. This is the more popular theory, but just leads to more questions than answers. First, why would Victor murder his friend? Was he just jealous and finally snapped? Was he planning this all along? Victor had a completely clean criminal record. Also, where is he now? Experts on the area do not believe it would be impossible to make it to civilization from their campsite, but it would be extremely difficult, especially in the middle of the night and not knowing where to go. In the months that followed this crime, news came out that surprised Victor's friends and even his family. Prior to this trip, Victor was undergoing a lot of therapy, and he had been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or more commonly called split personality. It was not believed that Victor was violent in any way, but it did lead to one more theory. That is that Victor did kill Marcus, but didn't know what he was doing. Another personality had taken over, a violent one. Eventually, Victor would have returned to his more common self and, realizing what he'd done, panicked and ran into the night. Experts on split personality argue over this theory, but his personal therapist would not comment on specifics of their session. Nevertheless, it still leads to one big question. Where is Victor today? 6 years later, this case is no closer to being solved than when it took place. Most believe he did murder his friend, out of jealousy. He would have had the element of surprise if Marcus was sleeping. He then attempted to escape into the night, only to get lost and eventually die from starvation or exposure, and it's just a matter of time before his body is found. Others believe the last part of that story is not true. Victor was very smart, and he did manage to make it to civilization, and he is currently living in a small remote village under a new name. Maybe one day we will learn the truth, as this case is still fresh. But all that we know is that there may, or may not, be a murderer pretending to be someone else somewhere in the Andes Mountains, or potentially anywhere in the world. So that concludes our third story. Do you know which one is false? Could it be story number 1? 2 bodies discovered on the side of the road, only to have their identities discovered 45 years later, but the murderer remaining unknown? Or story number 2, a group of 4 robbers evading capture for almost a decade, only to simply stop their string of robberies for seemingly no reason? Or 3, the 2 friends who went hiking only to have one strangled in his sleep and the other disappear into the pitch black Andes Mountains. Let's start with story number 1. The story of the 2 people who went missing only to have their identities uncovered 45 years later is completely true. The true names being Pamela Buckley and James Fruand. No one knows who the murderer is, and digging into this story leaves more questions unanswered. But as of this year, momentum has picked back up on this case, likely due to their identities just being uncovered earlier. If you have any more information on this case, please contact your local authorities. Now, let's move on to story number 2. The story of the armored truck heist that is believed to have spanned for 8 years or more by a gang of 4 is also true. The robbers were even considered polite due to the fact that they never killed anyone, but not everyone shares this thought. That means that story number 3, 2 hikers, completely made up. Were you able to guess the made up story? Please comment your guess down below and make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you all for listening and have a wonderful day.